The desert doesn't care what you're carrying. It doesn't care about the weight on your back or the weight you can't set down or the fact that you've been awake since 3 in the morning running numbers in a notebook that nobody asked you to keep. It just sits there flat and red and indifferent, baking under a sun that rises like a punishment and stays like one. Wren Dalloway had been at FOB Ironside for 11 hours when she realized no one was going to speak to her directly for the foreseeable future. This wasn't new. She was used to rooms that rearranged themselves around her absence. What she wasn't used to, what she had never quite learned to stop noticing, was the specific quality of the silence that followed her through a base where everyone already knew each other's names and nobody knew hers. If you're hearing this story for the first time, stay with it. What happens in the desert heat on a ridge? No one authorized her to climb at a distance. Most people would call impossible. It doesn't happen because she was lucky. It happens because she had been preparing for it for 6 years without knowing that was what she was doing. The morning she arrived, the thermometer on the equipment shed already read 108 degrees. It was 6 in the morning. She stepped down from the transport vehicle with her pack across both shoulders and her rifle case in her left hand, and she stood still for exactly the amount of time it took her eyes to read the base layout perimeter motor pool operations tent, the ridgeline to the northeast she'd already memorized from the topographic maps she'd reviewed on the drive-in. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then she started walking. Sergeant Major Cale Browd was standing near the operations tent with a water bottle and the particular posture of a man who has run enough missions that his body defaults to tactical assessment regardless of what his face is doing. He was broad-weathered with close-cropped gray at the temples, and eyes that moved the way experienced operators' eyes move, not toward the obvious thing, but toward everything around the obvious thing. He saw her, looked at her for 2 seconds, looked away. That was the whole of it. Not hostile, not dismissive exactly, just the efficient calculation of a man who had already sorted her into a category and moved on to the next problem. The rest of Razorback team was scattered across the briefing area running equipment checks. She counted them without making it obvious she was counting. 6 operators. 2 she recognized from theater records, Specialist Odom, who had an IED injury 3 years back and moved slightly favoring his left. Corporal Thomas Varick, 26 youngest on the team, who was doing a function check on his rifle with the focused care of someone who actually worried about the small things. The others she filed away for later faces billed how they moved, which ones talked too much and which ones didn't talk enough. None of them spoke to her. She found the bunk room she'd been assigned a partitioned space in the secondary accommodation building, 8 feet by 10, with a cot and a locker and a single window, looking out over the motor pool, and if she pressed her face to the right side of the glass, the northeastern ridge. She set her rifle case on the cot and began her standard post-transit check. Not because she thought anything had been disturbed, because the routine was the routine, and the routine was one of the few things she trusted completely. She broke the rifle down in sequence, checked each component with the particular attention of someone whose hands know the work better than her conscious mind does. While she worked, she could hear voices through the thin partition wall Razorback team in the adjacent common area, loose and comfortable with each other, the way teams get after enough shared time in bad places. She wasn't trying to listen. She couldn't help hearing. Support element, attachment, long-range precision. Who's called? Regiments, don't ask me. A pause. Someone set a metal cup down on a hard surface. She looks like she's about 12. Nobody corrected this. Nobody said anything in either direction. The conversation moved on to the mission brief timeline, and Wren finished reassembling the rifle, set it down, and opened her notebook. It was a small thing. Soft cover brown, the corners worn down to bare cardboard from years of going in and out of pockets. The pages weren't dated or organized in any way that would make sense to someone else, columns of numbers mostly. Wind direction, wind speed, time of reading, estimated error at various distances, occasionally a word or two shifting consistent watch the east. Her instructor at the Special Operations Sniper course, a retired Master Sergeant named Gideon Farst, had made every candidate in her cohort keep one from the first week. "You're not recording the wind to predict it," he'd told them in the flat, patient voice of a man who had said the same thing many times and expected most of them to understand it eventually. "You're recording the wind to learn how it thinks. That takes longer than 1 deployment. It takes longer than 5. You're building a library. Start now." Most of her cohort had stopped keeping the log within a year. Wren had kept it every morning since, including the 3 weeks she'd been stateside after Kandahar, sitting in her apartment at 5 a.m. with the window cracked, writing down what the wind was doing over the parking lot because Gideon Farst was gone and the only thing left of him that mattered was the habit. She wrote down the morning's numbers. The wind off the Sonoran Flats was coming from the southwest at 12 to 14 knots, gusting intermittently to 18. Hot. Dry. The kind of wind that didn't shift direction much but played with elevation, accelerating through gaps in the terrain and slowing in the shadow of ridge lines. She noted that. She noted the northeastern ridge, specifically elevation differential from the base floor approximately 300 meters. Distance from her current position roughly 800. She closed the notebook and put it in her left breast pocket. The mission briefing was at 1400 hours. 8 people in the operations tent. Browd, the 6 Razorback operators, and Wren at the end of the table. The tent smelled like dust and electronics and coffee that had been on the burner too long. 2 fans ran continuously and moved the hot air around without cooling anything. Browd ran the brief himself. He was good at it. Clean, sequential, no wasted language. Operation Dustline, direct action against a confirmed insurgent observation post operating in the canyon system northeast of the base. The post was relaying logistics intelligence on coalition supply routes. 3 successful interdictions in the past 7 weeks, pattern suggesting a direct line between the post and active interdiction cells. Taking it out would degrade the network's operational sightlines significantly. The planned approach, a dry riverbed and arroyo running northeast through broken terrain and emptying into the canyon mouth, approximately 3 kilometers from the objective. Cover from aerial observation, hardpack underfoot, manageable incline. Browd had run arroyo approaches before. The team had. It was the right terrain choice for the objective given the alternatives. Wren was looking at the topographic overlay when she saw it. Not a dramatic thing, not something that announced itself, just a configuration of contour lines and elevation markers that she had seen before in a different form. The canyon walls on either side of the arroyo running 40 to 60 meters above the floor for a sustained stretch of approximately 900 meters. The ridgelines on the eastern side specifically had 2 shelf formations that matched a profile she had filed in the back of her mind since reading the theater intelligence summary on the transport drive. The 3 interdiction events. The same structure each time, elevated observation converging fire withdrawal before air support could respond. They used high ground. Always. She looked at the eastern ridgeline above the arroyo entry point. She looked at the elevation markers. She looked at where the team would be in the open channeled between walls that would focus blast pressure and eliminate lateral movement options at the precise moment they were farthest from both the entry point and the objective. She raised her hand. Browd looked at her the way a professor looks at an unfamiliar student who has interrupted a lecture that wasn't meant for questions. Not unkind. Not welcoming. Sergeant Dalloway. The arroyo approach puts the team in a natural choke point for approximately 900 meters. She kept her voice level. Not tentative, not aggressive, just the words and the math. The eastern ridgeline has 2 shelf formations at 40 and 60 meters elevation that match the firing position profile from all 3 prior interdiction events. If they have intelligence on our timeline, which the pattern of those interdictions suggests, they have everything they need to set up a coordinated position before we reach the canyon mouth. The room was quiet. It was the particular quiet of people deciding whether to engage or absorb. Browd looked at the map, looked at the overlay, looked at her. The arroyo cuts 45 minutes off our insertion. It's the most defensible route under the operational timeline. It's defensible against observation, Wren said. It's not defensible against an elevated threat that already knows we're coming. Another silence. Longer. Your concern is noted, Sergeant. He looked back at the map. The approach stands as planned. Anything else? She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Long enough to be honest. Not long enough to make it something he needed to answer by force. No, sir. She looked back at the topographic overlay. She looked at the northeastern ridgeline. Not the arroyo, not the canyon, but the high ground above it. Ridge 7. Marked on the map with an elevation number and nothing else, a mound of rock and compressed desert soil that nobody had given a tactical reason to think about. She thought about it from that moment forward. After the briefing, she went back to her bunk room and spent 4 hours with the map and the ballistic tables she'd built from the morning wind readings. Ridge 7's summit was approximately 800 meters from the base, 300 meters of elevation gain over a slope that the topographic lines suggested was steep but not technical. From the summit, if the lines were accurate, she would have direct sight lines to both the Arroyo entry point and the eastern ridgeline shelf formations at a calculated range of just over 3,000 meters. 3,080 to be specific. She wrote the number down, then wrote the ballistic solution beneath it. Drop correction, wind hold at current conditions, bullet flight time at this distance in this air temperature. She wrote it twice from memory to check it. The solutions matched. She packed her kit for the mission. She packed it for Ridge 7. Not as a plan she'd announced. Not as a plan anyone had approved. Just as the only preparation that made sense given what she'd seen on that map, given what the numbers said was possible, given the fact that she had exactly one thing she could offer this team, that nobody else in the tent had 6 years of wind logs, and the particular attention of someone who had paid the worst possible price for being 2 degrees off. Kandahar lived in her hands. Not in her nightmares, she didn't dream about it. She felt it in the moment before every shot, the ghost sensation of a trigger that had pressed correctly and an impact that had arrived 0.3 seconds after the wind shifted. The operator who'd been hit behind her had recovered. Fully, mostly. He ran slower on his right side than he used to, which she knew because she'd tracked his subsequent deployment records, which she hadn't told him and wouldn't. Gideon Farst had called her 3 weeks after Kandahar. One of his brief calls, he wasn't a long conversation person. He'd said, the wind was wrong, your read was right, there's a difference. She'd said she understood. He'd said, you don't yet, you will. He'd died 4 months later, cardiac event, desert of New Mexico. Nothing dramatic about it, and she still had his call in her phone because she'd never thought to delete it. And then enough time passed that deleting it felt like a different kind of wrong. She wrote one more line in the wind log before she tried to sleep northeast. Ridge differential. Watch 0600. She didn't sleep for a long time after that. At some point close to midnight, she heard movement outside, footsteps on the packed dirt. Someone getting water from the common area. She recognized the pattern. Lighter than most of the team, Varick. She'd been cataloging footstep patterns since her first field deployment the same way she cataloged wind, because patterns were patterns, and the ones you paid attention to were the ones that eventually told you something. She stared at the ceiling. The notebook was on the cot beside her. She didn't open it again. Earlier that afternoon, between the briefing and her kit preparation, she'd been doing a dry fire sequence outside the equipment shed, working through a breathing cycle with her body flat against the hot concrete base of the wall when Brode came around the corner heading toward the motor pool. He'd been alone. He'd stopped when he saw her the way a person stops when a detail doesn't match the picture they built. He'd stood there for a moment. She'd kept her breathing pattern without pausing. I've run 42 direct action missions, he'd said finally, not particularly to her, more as if he were sorting something out loud. I've never lost a primary element operator on a planned approach. She'd finished the breath cycle before answering. I know you're Record Sergeant Major. He'd looked at her then, not the quick assessment from that morning, but something more deliberate. Then you know the risk analysis has already been done. The risk analysis didn't account for a 7-week pattern suggesting real-time intelligence access on coalition timelines. He'd been quiet for a moment. Then, you said your piece in the briefing. Yes, sir? Good. He'd looked away toward the motor pool, then back. Something in his face wasn't quite what she'd seen at the briefing, not open but not entirely closed. More like a door that might be holding weight on the other side. Get some rest. We move at 0600. He'd left. She'd gone back to her breathing cycle. She hadn't expected to change his mind. She hadn't come to FOB Ironside to change minds. She'd come to do the job that her record said she could do, which apparently wasn't the same thing as being allowed to do it. She understood the math of his position. He had a team that trusted him, that had operated together long enough to function like a single organism. She was an unknown variable attached from outside 24 hours, in contradicting a plan built on 42 prior successes. From where he stood, the most dangerous thing in the tent wasn't the Arroyo. It was the operator he didn't know suggesting the operator he trusted was wrong. That didn't mean he was right. It didn't mean she was wrong. It meant the only thing that had ever actually settled questions like this, the ground in real time with everything on the line. The wind picked up slightly around 2 in the morning. She heard it through the window, a low, sustained pressure against the glass that hadn't been there at midnight. She got up, cracked. The window held her palm out for 15 seconds. Southwest again, slightly stronger. Maybe 16 knots. She wrote down the time and the reading in the notebook, closed it, and went back to the cot. She was still lying there when the sky outside the window shifted from black to a deep charcoal, and then to the particular deep orange of a desert morning that has already made up its mind to be brutal. She got up at 5, dressed, gathered the notebook, and went out to the eastern edge of the motor pool, where the terrain gave her a clear angle on the northeastern ridgeline. She sat down on the ground with her back against the low concrete barrier and watched the light come up over Ridge 7. It looked exactly like it had looked on the map. 100-meter prominence of broken rock above the desert floor, sharp against the sky, with the upper section catching the early light in flat plains while the lower slope stayed in shadow. She ran the angles in her head from memory. The math was the same as last night. She heard footsteps behind her, lighter than Browd, not Varick's pattern either. She turned. It was Varick. He had a metal cup in one hand and the careful expression of someone who has walked somewhere without fully deciding why. He looked at her, looked at the ridge, looked at the notebook in her hands. He sat down on the concrete barrier about 2 feet away without asking. Not close enough to be an intrusion, not far enough to be polite distance. The exact gap of someone trying to figure out whether they're welcome. She looked back at the ridge. He drank from his cup. The wind moved between them, that same low southwest push she'd been tracking since midnight. "What are you dialing for?" he said finally. She glanced at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ridge too, with the concentrated expression of someone working on a problem that wasn't entirely clear yet. "Something that might not matter," she said. He nodded slow, as if that were a complete answer, as if the might not were the part that made sense to him. "Okay," he said. He finished his coffee. The sun cleared the eastern edge of the base perimeter, and the temperature, which had been a dry and bearable 92, moved to something past that in under 10 minutes. Wren wrote the 6 a.m. reading in the notebook. Southwest 16 knots consistent. She made a note. Ridge shadow will burn off by 700. Surface heating on east face by 7:30. Updraft potential. Varick stood to go. He looked at the notebook one more time, not nosily, just registering it. Then he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has seen something they recognize without being sure where from. He went back inside without saying anything else. Wren sat with the notebook in the growing heat, watching Ridge 7 lose its shadow, and calculated the exact window during which the angle and the wind and the light would all hold at the same time. It was there. Narrow, but there. She closed the notebook and put it back in her breast pocket against her chest, where she'd carried it for 6 years, without once thinking it was sentimental. Then she stood, rolled her shoulders once against the weight of what the morning already knew, and went inside to finish preparing her kit. In 4 hours, Razorback team would mount up and drive northeast into a desert that didn't care about any of their plans. She already knew which direction she was going to turn. Words 2987. Châu đã thôi nhận ra đang ở 2987 từ mỗi khoảng 60% mục tiêu. Để đạt đủ 5.000 từ theo yêu cầu, tôi cần viết tiếp phần còn lại của Part 1. Tiếp tục ngay từ điểm dừng Hutronon. 4 hours wasn't much time. For most people in most situations, it wouldn't be enough. Wren had learned at the course, Gideon Farst's course, the one where half the candidates washed out before week 3, that time was not the variable that mattered. Preparation was. Time was just what preparation happened inside of. She laid her kit out on the cot in the order she would need it. Primary rifle scope already calibrated to the morning's conditions, with the understanding that she would recheck at the objective. Spare ammunition in the configuration she used for sustained independent operation, not the standard load which assumed resupply at the team's pace, but the distribution she'd worked out over years of operating alone. Water 3 liters, which was 2 liters less than the recommended allotment for extreme heat operations, but she'd made the calculation against the weight of the climb and the window she needed to reach and decided 3 was the number she could carry up that slope and still have hands steady enough to matter. She'd stopped being sentimental about water on her second deployment. You carried what you could use. The rest was weight that cost you something when the terrain turned steep. There was a medical kit standard, a radio team frequency already loaded, And the notebook, which technically wasn't kit, wasn't on any equipment manifest, wasn't sanctioned gear, wasn't anything the Army had an opinion about either way. It went in the left breast pocket, the same place it had been every day for 6 years, next to her sternum, where she could feel the slight weight of it when she breathed. At 10 o'clock, she heard the team running through final equipment checks in the common area. The particular percussive sequence of it, Function Checks magazine seating the specific metallic sound that hardware makes when it's being handled by people who've handled it enough times that they don't have to think about what they're doing. She'd always found that sound steadying, not comforting exactly, just honest. This was what the work actually was when you stripped away everything else. She sat on the cot with her hands in her lap and worked through a breathing sequence. Not the tactical breathing they taught everywhere, the 4-count and 4-count hold, 4-count out, something slower than that, something Farst had shown her in the second week of the course when she'd been having trouble with her trigger hand. He'd said most people tried to eliminate the physical response to stress, which was impossible. The body was going to feel the weight of what it was about to do. The question was whether you learned to move with it rather than fight it. The wind doesn't owe you anything, he'd said. Neither does your own body. You owe them your attention. That's the whole transaction. She breathed. In the common area, someone laughed at something Odom, she thought, by the register. The laugh of a man who was comfortable, who trusted the people around him, who had done this enough times that the nerves had transmuted into something more useful. She didn't have that here. She didn't have the history with this team, the accumulated small moments that built the thing Brood was actually protecting when he'd dismissed her reading of the Arroyo. She wasn't sure she would have listened to herself either in his position. What she was sure of was what she'd seen on that map, and what the wind had been doing all morning over the northeastern terrain, and what the numbers said was possible from a position that wasn't in anyone's plan. At 11:30, Broud called the team together for a final pre-mission review. She was at the back of the group, not excluded, just not included, which was a distinction that mattered more in theory than in practice. He covered the timeline, the comms protocol, the contingency signals. He covered the extraction route. He did not revisit the approach. She looked at the topographic overlay one more time. The Arroyo, clean and logical on paper. The eastern ridgeline above it with its 2 shelf formations. Ridge 7 marked with its elevation number and nothing else. Any questions? Not a question from Brood, a closing. Nobody spoke. She picked up her kit. At 12:15, she was at the vehicle line when Varric appeared at her left. He fell into step without announcement, not looking at her directly, watching the motor pool ahead of them with the mildly preoccupied expression of a man whose mind was running 2 tracks at once. They walked in silence for a moment. "The chute you were calculating this morning," he said. "On the ridge." He paused, choosing something. "What range?" She looked at him sidelong. He was still watching the motor pool. "A long one." He processed that. She could see it in the slight change of his jaw, the way his eyes moved over the northeastern terrain as if he was running the geometry himself. He was smart, this one. She'd registered that in the briefing he was the only operator who had followed her point about the eastern shelf formations with his eyes on the map rather than on her face, which meant he'd been evaluating the terrain rather than the source. 3,000, he said. She said nothing. 3,000's a long way. Depends on the conditions. He looked at her then for a real moment, not the quick catalog of that first morning. Something was working behind his eyes that wasn't skepticism and wasn't acceptance either. More like the particular attention of someone who has encountered a piece of information they didn't expect and is deciding what category it belongs in. "Yeah," he said finally, and went back to his vehicle. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement she'd received since arriving. She filed it away in the part of her mind that she kept for things that mattered but couldn't be acted on yet. The vehicles rolled at 1300. 4 of them, 2 tactical trucks carrying the primary element, 1 command vehicle in the rear truck where she sat with Varric and a quiet operator named Kellum, who seemed to communicate primarily through the position of his eyebrows. The desert outside the windows was enormous and absolutely indifferent the way desert always was. Flat in the near distance, broken at the middle range by the sudden vertical intrusion of canyon country. And beyond that, a sky so wide and so blue it looked like something a person had made up. She watched the terrain read itself as they drove, the Sonoran Flats giving way to the broken rock country northeast of the base. Harder ground now, less sand, more exposed stone, worn down by 10,000 years of the same heat they were driving through. She tracked the ridgelines. She noted where the slopes softened and where they sharpened. She found Ridge 7 at 20 kilometers out, and watched it resolve from a theoretical elevation marker on a map into an actual physical object in the actual physical world, which was always the moment where plans either held together or started to come apart. It held together. The slope was what the topographic lines had said it was. The summit was visible, a broken outcrop of pale rock against the sky, elevated above the surrounding terrain in a way that was going to give her exactly the sight lines she'd calculated and no others. She put her hand in her left breast pocket, felt the edge of the notebook. At the dismount point, the vehicle stopped and the team was out in under 90 seconds. Browd pulled them into a tight cluster and ran a final 30-second confirmation objective comms contingency. Wind at the dismount was stronger than the morning read. She registered it without looking like she was registering it the way you learned to do when you needed information that nobody else was paying attention to. Southwest 20 to 22 knots. Gusting. The updraft off the rocky terrain was contributing. She made the adjustment in her head to the ballistic solution she'd built at 3 in the morning and confirmed at 6 and reviewed twice more since. The solution held. The window held. Browd gave the signal. Team Razorback moved northeast toward the arroyo. Wren looked at the canyon entrance. She looked at the sky. She looked at ridge 700-800 meters to the northwest, the summit catching the afternoon sun in flat plains the same way it had caught the morning light 6 hours ago. She had said what she'd seen. She'd said it once clearly professionally, and she'd been heard and overruled by a man who had 42 successful approaches to draw on and every reason to trust his own judgment. She didn't resent him for it. Resentment was weight she couldn't afford on an 800-meter climb. She turned northwest. Nobody was looking back. The team was already 10 meters into the approach heads forward, the focused momentum of operators who had committed to a direction. Browd was on point. Varick was fourth in column. She watched them move for exactly long enough to confirm that no one had eyes on her position. Then she walked toward the base of Ridge 7 and started to climb. The slope was steeper in the first 200 meters than the topographic lines had quite captured that compression of elevation that maps did when the contour intervals weren't tight enough. She adjusted her pace and her center of gravity and kept moving. The rock underfoot was loose in the upper layer and solid underneath, which meant you had to test each step before committing weight, which added time which she'd accounted for in the 47-minute window she'd given herself. She had enough time. Barely. The heat was a physical pressure at this elevation, the air thinner than the base floor and somehow hotter for the lack of ground to absorb it. Her water was in the pack and she didn't stop for it. She breathed through the pattern Farst had taught her, the one that kept the hands steady and the calculation running even when the body was at close to its working limit. She climbed. At 200 meters, she looked back once. The vehicles were still at the dismount point. She could see the shapes of them in the afternoon shimmer. Nothing else visible. She faced forward and continued. At 250, her radio carried a check-in from the team's movement cadence. Varick's voice standard interval call, nothing in it but position and status. Clean, still moving. She listened without keying back. She was in support, attachment, observation, posture, and until she had something to report, radio silence was the right call. At 300 meters the summit, she went prone before she had fully caught her breath. She opened her rifle case, assembled the system in the practice sequence that lived below conscious thought after enough repetition, brought the scope up, and then stopped breathing for a moment, not from the climb, but from what the optics showed her. The eastern ridgeline of the Arroyo approach was exactly where she'd calculated it would be from this position. The elevation, the distance, the sight lines, all exactly as the map had suggested. And on the shelf formation 40 meters above the Arroyo floor, the flat rock face she'd identified from the terrain analysis the night before, there were people. Not one, not two, 7. They were working, not watching. Setting up, which meant they'd been there long enough to feel certain of their timing and not yet long enough to be done. She could see the specific configuration without needing to inventory it: elevated position, converging angle on the Arroyo entry point, withdrawal route already prepped on the far side of the ridge. They weren't expecting anyone to come from the northwest. They weren't expecting anyone to be on Ridge 7. Because nothing in their operational framework told them to put anyone there, because nothing in the coalition approach doctrine for this terrain type put a shooter on Ridge 7, because at 3,080 meters in the Sonoran afternoon heat with a 22-knot crosswind, nobody was supposed to be a factor from this position. She keyed the radio. "Razorback, this is Dalloway. I have visual on 7 hostile contacts, Eastern Ridgeline Arroyo entry point. Elevated position, active setup. You are approaching a coordinated ambush. Do you copy? Static. She tried again. Static. The wind at this elevation was doing something to the signal. She'd noted the elevation differential as a potential comms factor and hadn't been able to account for it fully without knowing the team's exact radio configuration. She changed frequency to the secondary channel and tried again. A fragment. Brode's voice, she thought, 2 words obscured by interference. She looked back through the scope. The 7 figures on the ridge were still working. She had a window that was going to close. She opened her notebook to the last entry. Southwest 16 knots, consistent. Updraft potential. She looked at the wind against the ridge face below her. She could see it in the dust. It was lifting at the canyon mouth. Read the speed from the movement of the lightest particles. Adjust for the elevation differential, account for the thermal updraft off the eastern rock face that was running at approximately the speed her morning calculation had predicted. She wrote one more number. Then she closed the notebook. She put it back in her left breast pocket, and she put her cheek against the stock and breathed and let the work she had been building since the morning she arrived, since Kandahar. If she was being honest, since every morning of 6 years, when she'd sat somewhere with a notebook and paid attention to something most people drove past without looking at, begin to mean something. She built the first solution in the time it took to exhale. Not constructed, retrieved. The numbers were already there, assembled across the previous 18 hours in a sequence so many times reviewed that they had stopped being calculations and become something closer to physical memory, the way a door handle feels before your eyes reach it. Elevation. Distance. Wind. The thermal differential off the eastern rock face that she'd noted at 6 in the morning and adjusted for twice since. 3,080 meters to the center of the shelf formation, 22 knots southwest with the updraft variable she'd quantified from the dust movement at the canyon mouth 11 minutes ago. Bullet flight time at this range approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which the wind could do whatever it had already decided to do without consulting her, without caring about the 8 people moving through the arroyo below who didn't know the shelf formation above them was occupied. She tracked the first figure through the scope. The man was kneeling at the western edge of the position, setting up what she'd initially read as a support weapon, now resolved clearly into an RPG rig, bipod-mounted, oriented down the arroyo approach corridor, with the deliberate angle of someone who had been told exactly where to point it. She built the hold. Left of center, 17 meters of lateral correction for the wind at this range. Drop adjusted for altitude and barrel temperature. She had been holding her position for 4 minutes and the barrel was warm but not hot. The Sonoran afternoon did that to metal, and she'd accounted for the velocity variance that came with it. She did not rush. Rushing was the other version of this. The version where she'd told herself the math was close enough where the weight of the moment had leaned on the trigger hand before the solution was complete. She was intimate with that version. She'd lived in its aftermath for 3 years. She waited for the gap in the gusting. The wind off the desert ran in a pattern she'd been reading since the morning. Not regular, not predictable in the way a metronome is predictable, but patterned. The way all wind was patterned if you had watched it long enough. Intervals of relative steadiness lasting 2 to 4 seconds between gusts. In those intervals, the lateral push dropped to its baseline and held there, and the turbulence off the upper ridge face diminished enough that the ballistic arc would fly true. She tracked the gap. It came. She pressed. The rifle moved the way it always moved, rearward, controlled the recoil, absorbed through the system and into her shoulder with the mechanical efficiency of something that had been set up correctly. She cycled the bolt immediately and returned to the scope. 4 seconds. She had learned not to think during those 4 seconds. Thinking was interference. The calculation was already made, the trigger was already pressed, the bullet was already in the air, doing what physics and her preparation had set it in motion to do. What she did instead was watch not the target specifically, but the air around the target. Reading the wind indicators she could see at the far end. A small dust lift off the rock edge, the angle of a piece of loose fabric she'd noted on a second figure's pack. The gap held for 3.8 seconds. The first figure went down. She was already on the second. He had heard something, not the shot, the distance, and the wind had taken care of that, but something, maybe the particular silence of a man who had been making noise and then wasn't. He turned, scanning the canyon floor below, scanning the near ridgeline, his eyes moving in the pattern of someone who understood threat but hadn't yet understood direction. He was not looking at Ridge 7. Why would he? 3,000 meters was not in anyone's mental threat model for this terrain, this mission type, this equipment. She was operating outside the frame entirely. That gap would last as long as it lasted, and then it would close, and the remaining 5 would start looking in directions she hadn't planned for. Wind gap. Second figure. She pressed, cycled, returned, 4 seconds. He went down, 2 of 7. Now the shelf formation showed the particular quality of a group that had absorbed information without processing it, movement without direction, figures looking at each other rather than at anything external, the 2-second interval between something happening and people deciding what it meant. She had that interval. She used it. The third figure was on the far end of the position, partial concealment behind a rock outcrop, head up and scanning. Moving target which added lateral calculation to the base solution. She read his pace. He was moving left to right across her field of view at approximately 1 meter per second. Not fast tactical movement, careful. She led him by the distance a bullet traveled in the time it took to cover his walking pace across 4 seconds of flight. The gap was shorter this time. The gusting had picked up a half step in rhythm. She waited. The window opened narrower than the first 2. She pressed. Third figure. Not a clean stop. He went down behind the rock outcrop, and she couldn't confirm from her angle, which meant she had to hold him as a variable and continue. This was the part they didn't put in the qualification standards. You worked with what you could see, and you held what you couldn't, and you moved forward, because stopping to resolve every ambiguity was how the people below you ran out of time. Her radio crackled. A fragment Broud's voice, she thought 3 words that the elevation interference shredded to consonants and wind noise. She keyed once in return. Whether it went through, she didn't know. The fourth figure had oriented correctly, not on her on the canyon below, which meant he was still running the wrong threat model, but he had a weapon up and a general direction, and that was enough to make him the priority. Wind gap. Fourth figure. The shot broke in the narrow interval, and she cycled without waiting to see the impact, because she already knew the solution had been right the same way she always knew. Not confidence, not certainty, but the accumulated recognition of what a good break felt like versus what a bad one did. She looked through the scope. He wasn't moving. 4 of 7. 31 seconds had elapsed since the first shot. The remaining 3 figures had arrived at understanding. She could see it in how they moved, no longer the disoriented scanning of people who didn't know what they were reacting to, but the specific contracted movement of people who knew they were being engaged from a fixed position and were trying to decide whether to hold or run. 2 of them broke left toward the reverse slope of the ridge where the terrain gave them cover from above. The third held position at the center of the shelf, flat against the rock face, not moving. She tracked the 2 who were running. The one on the left was faster. She took him first, moving target uphill, partial obscuration from the terrain as he crested the ridge edge. The calculation was not simple. She did it anyway in the time available and pressed in the next gap. He stopped moving at the ridge crest. 5 of 7. The second runner had made better distance. She swung to him and lost him in a gust that brought the visibility at range down for approximately 6 seconds. Not storm-level reduction, but enough. When the air cleared, he was prone behind a rock formation on the reverse slope, showing minimal profile. Prone targets at this range were a different geometry. She adjusted hold, built a new solution for the angle. Her fourth finger was holding pressure on the trigger guard. Not the trigger the way Farst had taught, stay adjacent to the decision until the decision is final. She pressed. The small profile behind the rock stopped making the minor movements that indicated breathing and position shifts. 6 of 7. The figure who had held position at the center of the shelf was gone. She swept the scope across the full shelf formation, left edge center, right the outcrop where the third figure had gone down the reverse slope below the fifth. Nothing moving that she could confirm as hostile. The third figure, the partial confirmation, was not visible from her angle. She worked the radio again. Full team frequency, then secondary, then the base emergency channel. Razorback, this is Dalloway. 6 confirmed down eastern ridgeline. 1 unconfirmed position lost on reverse slope. I am holding Ridge 7 summit. Do you copy? Static. Then at the bottom of it, something that might have been a voice. She tried once more. The fragment was clearer this time, not words she could parse, but the pattern of Broud's cadence. He was transmitting. The signal wasn't making it clean in either direction, which meant they had partial awareness and were operating on fragments. She went back to the scope. The shelf was still. The reverse slope below the 6th confirmed was still. She held for 90 seconds, scanning the full sector Arroyo entry point, eastern ridgeline, the terrain north of both. Nothing moved that shouldn't be moving. And then something did. Not on the ridgeline, below it. On the desert floor northeast of the Arroyo exit point, approximately 600 meters past where Team Razorback's planned route would bring them out of the canyon system. A vehicle. Or the shape of one, a low silhouette resolving through the heat distortion at that distance into the specific geometry of a truck moving carefully across broken terrain without headlights in the late afternoon sun. Not Coalition. Coalition vehicles at this range in this sector ran with identification markers visible. This didn't. She ranged it. 2,800 meters from her position, moving southeast at what she estimated as 15 kilometers per hour. At that speed and direction, it would reach the Arroyo exit corridor in approximately 14 minutes. She keyed the radio immediately. Razorback, I have a vehicle contact northeast of your extraction point. 2,800 meters moving southeast, estimated 14 minutes to your exit corridor. Possible blocking element. Do you copy? This time, the fragment came back almost complete. Brood's voice clipped and controlled the particular compression of a man receiving information that was changing the shape of his problem in real time. Copy vehicle position. Then static. She held position and watched the vehicle. It was moving with a purpose she recognized, not directly toward anything but along a line that would intersect with something. Flanking, not charging. The approach of a force that already knew where the target was going to be and was positioning to be there first. The shelf formation had been the first part. This was the second. She tracked the vehicle and ran the firing solution in parallel crosswind. At this range, the longer flight time, the target moving laterally, which required a lead calculation that added a variable on top of the base wind hold. It was solvable. Solvable wasn't the same as simple. And a moving vehicle at 2,800 meters in afternoon heat distortion was a different problem than a stationary personnel target on a shelf formation. She was still working the solution when the vehicle stopped. Not at the Arroyo exit. Short of it, in a shallow depression in the terrain that put it below the sight line from the canyon mouth. Whoever was driving understood defilade. They parked in the low ground and the truck went still, and for 90 seconds nothing happened. Then 2 figures emerged from the vehicle and took positions flanking it. She couldn't resolve what they were carrying at this range in this heat shimmer. She could resolve that they weren't leaving. Razorback. She kept her voice flat. This was not the moment for urgency. In tone, urgency in tone made people move faster than information traveled, which was how friendly decisions got made on bad data. Vehicle has stopped. 2 personnel ground position in defilade. Coordinates follow. She gave the grid. Static. She gave it again. The fragment that came back this time had Torres's voice in it. She'd cataloged the team's radio cadences over 2 days of listening, and Torres was easy to identify, the particular clipped quality of someone who communicated in the minimum necessary syllables. She caught the end of it. Say again, 2 personnel. 2 confirmed possible more inside vehicle. In defilade northeast of your extraction route. I cannot engage at this angle. Repeat, cannot engage. Advise change of extraction routing or delay exit until I can reposition. She was already reading the terrain for a repositioning option. Ridge 7's summit gave her the eastern sector clearly, but the shallow depression the vehicle had parked in was in the dead ground created by the terrain fold at 2,800 meters. The same fold that made it good cover for them was the same fold that cut it from her firing angle. She needed to move south along the ridge drop approximately 40 meters of elevation and find a new position. That would cost her 11 to 15 minutes depending on the footing on the southern face. Razorback's estimated transit time through the Arroyo to the exit corridor, 12 to 16 minutes depending on how cautious Browd was running the approach after the fragment transmissions she'd been putting out. The margins did not work. She keyed once more. Razorback, I am repositioning south on Ridge 7. Maintain current pace. I need 12 minutes. If you exit the corridor before I have a firing solution on the vehicle, hold at the canyon mouth and wait for my signal. Do you copy? The static held for 4 seconds. Then Browd's voice came through, compressed and broken but complete enough to matter. Copy, Dalloway. We have the vehicle. We're holding. She was already moving. The southern face of Ridge 7 was not the route she'd climbed that had been the northwestern approach selected for its angle to the summit rather than speed. The southern face was steeper in the upper section and looser underfoot, the kind of terrain that gave you options if you were careful and punished you immediately if you weren't. She moved fast. Not reckless, she couldn't afford an ankle on this slope, but at the boundary of what the terrain would support, testing each placement with the specific economy of someone who understood that every unnecessary second was a second the vehicle in the depression wasn't being dealt with. At 30 meters below the summit, her left foot broke through a surface crust of dried earth and she dropped to her right knee on the rock beneath it. The impact was solid. She was up in 2 seconds, checked the knee, checked her grip on the rifle case, continued. The knee was bruised. Functional. At the 40-meter mark below the summit, she found a shelf of exposed rock running south and slightly lower, a natural bench in the ridge face that gave her a sight line west and southwest. She went prone and brought the scope up. The depression was visible from this angle, partially the near edge of it, which showed the back half of the truck and the position of the 2 personnel she'd confirmed. Enough. She ranged the new position, 2660 to the truck. The angle had changed enough that she needed to rebuild the lateral wind correction. She was now shooting with a different cross angle to the wind, which moved the required hold from 17 meters left to approximately 12 right. She ran it. Built the solution. The 2 figures were still in position flanking the vehicle, not moving toward anything. Waiting. She keyed the radio. Razorback, I have partial sight on the vehicle from secondary position. When you're ready to move. The response came back almost clean, which meant Brood had repositioned within the canyon system to improve his comms. Ready when you have a solution. She had a solution. She put the first figure in the reticle. The wind at this elevation and angle was doing something slightly different than the ridge summit. A minor clockwise rotation through the gap between Ridge 7 and the terrain fold to the east, adding perhaps 2 meters of additional right drift that she caught from the dust movement near the vehicle and adjusted for in the hold. Gap. She pressed. The figure on the left of the vehicle dropped. She cycled and swung right. The second figure had reacted, not running, bringing a weapon up toward the ridge, which confirmed that at this range, with the wind carrying the shot signature, they'd detected her general direction, not her exact position. The weapon he was orienting was not pointed at her rock shelf. She pressed on the second. He went down. Razorback, vehicle personnel neutralized, move now. Driver status unknown, treat vehicle as active until you can confirm. Broud's voice came back immediate. Moving. She held the position and watched the vehicle through the scope. It was still. For 30 seconds it was entirely still, and she read that stillness the way she read all stillness, not as absence of threat, but as information with a cause she hadn't identified yet. Then the driver's door opened. She was already there. The figure that stepped out was not bringing a weapon up, which in any other context might have read as surrender or confusion. In this context, in this position with a coalition team emerging from the canyon mouth 40 seconds away, a figure stepping out of a vehicle without a visible weapon was still a problem until it was demonstrably not. She watched. The figure took 3 steps from the vehicle, looked at the 2 personnel on the ground and stopped, then turned and ran. Not toward the arroyo. Perpendicular northeast into the open desert, the direction of least resistance and furthest from everything happening. She tracked him for 8 seconds. He covered 100 meters. She watched the angle, watched the distance open. She let him run. It was a decision she made without deliberating on it, which meant it was a decision the preparation had already made, the specific calibration of threat versus cost, the question of what this particular person represented to the immediate situation with Razorback at the canyon mouth. A fleeing individual moving away from the team's exit route, no weapon visible, increasing distance. She had 5 rounds remaining. She kept them. Razorback 3rd vehicle personnel is running northeast, no weapon visible, no immediate threat to your position. I am not engaging. Acknowledge. Acknowledged. And then after a pause of maybe 3 seconds, good call. 2 words. Not praise, just a man updating his understanding of her judgment in real time, which was a different thing entirely and meant more. Team Razorback came out of the canyon mouth 45 seconds later. She watched them through the scope, Broud on point, the team in movement formation, fanning into the open ground outside the arroyo exit, with the practiced efficiency of operators who had made this transition from enclosed terrain to open enough times that the adjustment was automatic. They moved to the vehicle. 2 operators checked it. Clear, no additional personnel, no secondary device, nothing she'd missed. She exhaled, slowly. The full exhale of someone who has been holding more than breath. Her knee was informing her now that the adrenaline was cycling down, that the impact on the rock face had been more significant than 2 seconds of assessment had suggested. Not structural, she tested it against the ridge under her. It held her weight without collapsing, which was the threshold she was working with. Below structural was the range of things she was going to have to stop noticing for as long as she needed to descend the ridge. She assembled her kit. The notebook went back in her breast pocket. She found she was holding it for a moment before putting it away, not dramatically, just the ordinary recognition of an object that had been with her through something. She descended. The climb down was not faster than the climb up, despite gravity and the relief of moving toward level ground. The terrain on the northwestern face was familiar, but the knee required more attention than forward momentum could fully mask, and she managed the compromise between speed and damage at a line that probably came out ahead on neither count. The desert offered no opinion on this. At 200 meters below the summit, her radio carried Browd's voice again. Clear. No interference. Dalloway, what's your status? Descending. 5 minutes to ground level. A pause. We'll hold. She stopped walking for exactly 1 second when she heard that, then continued. They held. Varick was at the base of the slope when she came down the last 50 meters of grade. He was facing away from her, watching the northeastern terrain, giving her the approach without making it obvious he was giving her anything. She filed that away. She came off the slope, and her boot found level ground, and the knee registered the transition clearly. She adjusted her weight distribution without stopping. Varick turned, looked at her knee, which was doing something visible through the fabric, looked at her face. Anything broken? No. He nodded, accepted that. Team's at the vehicle. Browd wants a face-to-face before we call extraction. She walked with him toward the vehicle without using him as a support, which was a decision about something other than her knee. Browd was standing at the front of the captured vehicle with his arms crossed, not in the posture of someone waiting for an argument, but in the posture of someone who had been carrying a significant thing and was deciding how to put it down. He watched her approach, watched her gait, didn't look at the knee. She stopped 6 feet from him. He looked at her for a long moment. The team was around them in the specific distributed attention formation of operators who were doing secondary tasks while tracking a primary event, which meant all of them were listening without appearing to. 7 on the shelf, Browd said. It wasn't a question. Yes. 2 on the vehicle. Yes. 1 runner. Northeast. Unarmed, no immediate threat to your extraction. He absorbed that sequence, not the numbers, the logic of it, the specific decision-making visible in the sequence. You left the runner, he said. Yes. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man working through something at the correct pace, which was slower than performance, but faster than avoidance. From Ridge 7, he said. Yes. At 3,100 meters. Not an accusation. Not disbelief either. Just a man saying a number and making it a question by the way he held it in the air. 3,080 to the shelf, 2,660 to the vehicle position. He looked away from her toward the ridge, the actual physical ridge, which from this distance looked smaller than its 300 meters of elevation and smaller still than what she'd done from it. Then he looked back. You told me in the briefing, he said. Yes. And I didn't listen. She said nothing to that. It wasn't a question and it wasn't an apology. It was a man saying a true thing to the open air. Browd uncrossed his arms. He looked at the team, a single pass of his attention around the perimeter. Something passed through the group in response, a shift in posture too small to name the particular adjustment of people who had processed something and were landing on the far side of it. Sergeant Dalloway. He said it carefully with the specific care of a man choosing how words would land in a record that existed in more than one form. Sergeant Major, good work. Not nice shooting or impressive or any of the things that would have put the 7 shots on the shelf and the 2 at the vehicle into a box labeled exceptional and then closed it. Just the 2 words that meant what they meant in the only context they existed in the work correctly done against a standard that had just become a different thing than it was 24 hours ago. She held his gaze for the appropriate amount of time. "Thank you, sir." He turned to Varick. "Call extraction. Medical advisory Dalloway has a knee injury, ambulatory, non-critical." He glanced back at her. "I'm putting that in the report regardless. Don't argue." She had no intention of arguing. Varick got on the radio. Odom drifted over to her left side, not obviously just finding a position that happened to be adjacent, which was the team's version of something she couldn't quite name yet and didn't try to. She stood in the late afternoon sun, knee throbbing in its controlled way notebook against her sternum, and looked northeast at the open desert where the runner had gone. He was not visible. He'd covered enough ground by now that the terrain had swallowed him, which was the outcome she'd calculated when she'd decided to let him run. The wind was still coming southwest, 16 to 18 knots. It had held its character through the whole afternoon. She reached into her breast pocket and took out the notebook, opened it to the last entry. She wrote one line, SW 16 to 18, consistent through engagement window. Solution held. She closed it. Behind her, Varick was talking to base, relaying the grid and the personnel count and the medical advisory and all the details that would become in the next 48 hours a formal record of something that didn't yet have a name in any current doctrine. She put the notebook away. The extraction bird would come from the southwest, she knew. She would hear it before she saw it. She stood in the desert that didn't care about any of them and waited for the sound that meant they were all going home. And she thought briefly, without ceremony, of a morning 6 years ago when Gideon Farst had put a blank notebook on the desk in front of her and said, "Start now." She had started. This was where starting had led. There was a version of this day she had carried for 3 years that was different from the version she was standing in, and she had checked it against reality from the ridge, the way she always checked her solutions twice from memory, looking for error. The solutions matched. The prior version and this one shared nothing, except the attention she'd paid in between. The wind picked up 2 knots. She felt it against her face. She didn't write it down. The extraction bird came in from the southwest, exactly as she'd known it would. She heard the rotors before anyone else said anything. A distant percussion beneath the wind, building in the particular way helicopter sound built when it was moving toward you across flat desert. Faint, then present, then suddenly filling the available air. She didn't point or announce it. She just turned to face the sound and waited. And 20 seconds later, Varick heard it too, and keyed the radio to confirm approach. The aircraft resolved out of the afternoon haze at roughly 300 meters, a dark shape against the orange-white sky, descending at the efficient angle of a pilot who had done this extraction enough times that the approach was muscle memory. It touched down 40 meters from the vehicle in a wash of rotor dust that turned the immediate world orange for about 8 seconds, and then the dust settled and the crew chief was at the door and the team was moving. Browd directed the boarding sequence without ceremony. Varick first, then Odom, then the others in order. Wren last, which was where she'd been since arriving at FOB Ironside, and which she had no opinion about. The crew chief looked at her knee when she climbed aboard. She didn't explain it. He handed her a cold pack anyway, which she accepted, and she pressed it against the joint through the fabric and felt the temperature begin its slow work. The aircraft lifted. Through the small window on the port side, she watched Ridge 7 shrink as they gained altitude. The summit where she'd spent 47 minutes going prone to standing and back again, the southern face where the rock shelf had caught her knee, the northwestern slope she'd climbed in the morning heat while the team moved into the arroyo. From this elevation, the ridge looked unremarkable. A prominence in a landscape of prominences, nothing about it that suggested what had happened there. She put her hand against the window glass. The vibration of the aircraft moved through her palm. Browd was seated 2 positions down the bench, watching the terrain below, with the focused distance of a man running a debrief in his head, not for the report which would come later, but the internal version, the one where you trace the decision tree backward, looking for the branch point. She recognized the look. She'd worn it herself for 3 years, tracing backward from Kandahar to the exact moment where the wind and the trigger had diverged. He looked up, found her watching him. Neither of them looked away for a moment. Then he said over the engine noise, "When we land, you're going to medical before debrief. That's not optional." "Understood." He held her gaze for 1 more second. Something in his face was doing a thing she'd seen in faces before in the specific aftermath of operations where something had happened that required a person to update a belief they'd held with significant confidence. It was not a comfortable process. He wasn't trying to make it look comfortable. "I'm going to have questions," he said. "I'll have answers." He nodded once, looked back out the window. Varick was watching her from the opposite bench, not analyzing, just present. He reached into his kit and produced a water bottle, which he held out across the aircraft. She took it, drank, handed it back. He put it away without comment. The aircraft crossed the base perimeter at 1914. The sun was at the horizon, the specific deep orange of Sonoran evenings that came on fast and didn't negotiate, turning the desert floor below them from red to something closer to copper. She watched it through the window until the aircraft descended below the good angle and the base structures came up instead. They landed. She climbed down. The medical officer was waiting at the edge of the landing pad, a captain named Farquhar Young, with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned to conduct initial assessments while people were still moving. She fell into step beside Wren without breaking her pace. Knee. Left. Impact on rock descent from elevated position. Ambulatory throughout. When did it happen? Approximately 1440. Farquhar looked at her watch. 4.5 hours ago. She said it without inflection, which was its own kind of inflection. Let's get imaging. The medical bay was cool, genuinely cool, the first air-conditioned space she'd been in since the transport vehicle that morning. The temperature differential hit her skin like a change of medium, the way water feels when you've been too long in sun. She sat on the examination table and let Farquhar do her work, and while the doctor's hands moved over the joint with practiced efficiency, Wren looked at the ceiling and ran the afternoon in sequence. Not the shots specifically, the decisions. The decision to radio rather than shoot without warning. The decision about the runner. The decision not to use Varick as a crutch on the descent, which had been about something other than the knee, and the decision to accept the water bottle, which had been about something other than thirst. Small things, the kind that didn't appear in reports. Contusion, probable bone bruise, Farquhar said. The imaging will confirm. You're not walking on a fracture, which is the thing I needed to know. She looked up. What you are walking on is something that needs 48 hours of non-load-bearing rest before it gets negotiated with. I understand. Farquhar looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of medical professionals who had heard "I understand" from operators before and knew exactly what it was worth. I'm going to put the imaging results in your record regardless of what you understand, she said. And I'm going to note the time of injury and the time of presentation, which will be part of the operational record. That's appropriate. Something shifted in Farquhar's expression, not warmth, but a recognition of something. She turned back to the imaging equipment. The debrief was at 2100. Same operations tent, same overhead light, same quality of attention from different people. Browd running it this time, not alone with Lieutenant Ullman from the Air Liaison Office seated to his left, and a JAG officer Wren hadn't seen before taking notes at the far end of the table. Varick was present. The rest of the team filtered in. Someone had made fresh coffee. Browd opened the session without preamble. Sergeant Dalloway operated from an unsanctioned position at Ridge 7 summit and secondary position on the southern face. She was not authorized to occupy either. She engaged 9 total hostile contacts across 2 separate events at ranges between 2,600 and 3,100 meters. All engagements were confirmed in the post-mission assessment. He paused. She also made a decision not to engage a 10th contact assessed as non-threatening. Another pause. The record will reflect all of it. He looked at her. Walk me through the decision sequence from the canyon dismount. She walked him through it. The same sequence she'd run in the medical bay, with the addition of the specific numbers and the specific wins and the specific reasoning at each branch point. She didn't shorten it. She didn't emphasize the things that sounded better and minimize the things that didn't. The JAG officer wrote without looking up. When she reached the decision about the runner, Browd stopped her. Explain that. Unarmed. Moving away from the team's exit corridor at increasing distance. Engaging would have required a reposition and a shot that would have delayed my radio contact with you by approximately 90 seconds. The threat calculation didn't support it. Browd held that for a moment. You had rounds remaining. Yes. Most operators would have taken the shot. She looked at him. I know. The silence was the kind that a room holds when something has been said that most of the people in it are going to be thinking about for longer than the conversation lasts. Then Varick said from his position at the table, "She called it in immediately. We had the vector." Browd looked at him, looked at the JAG officer, looked back at Wren. "Yes," he said. "She did." The debrief continued for another hour. When it closed, Browd remained at the table while the others filed out. Wren was gathering her kit when he spoke. "The briefing," he said, "yesterday." She looked at him. "You saw what you saw. You said it. I overrode it." He said this with the directness of someone who had decided somewhere in the aerial transit back to base that there was a version of this that he could live with and versions that he couldn't, and the version where he didn't say this clearly was one of the latter. "I want that on the record in the accurate form, not smoothed." She was quiet for a moment. "The record will reflect what happened in the canyon. That's sufficient." "It's not," he said. "Not for me." She looked at him across the table. This was the Browd beneath the 42 approaches, the man who had built those 42 successful approaches on a particular kind of honesty with himself, and who understood clearly that the honesty that had made him good was the same honesty that now required him to name what had happened in the briefing room and not call it something else. "The decision was yours to make," she said. "You made it with what you knew. What I knew was different. Why didn't you push harder? Because pushing harder wasn't going to change the outcome. Only the shot could." He absorbed that the way he'd absorbed things all afternoon, not quickly but completely. "And you were ready for the shot." "I prepared for the shot." The distinction mattered to him. She could see it in how he held it. He stood. "Medical said 48 hours. Take them." She would. He left. She sat in the empty tent for a moment in the specific quiet of a space that had held a significant amount of human weight and was now processing the absence of it. The fans were still running. The coffee smell had gone stale again. She took the notebook out of her breast pocket, set it on the table, looked at it. The cover was worn at all four corners, not recently, progressively over the years that the notebook had spent in pockets and packs, and the specific proximity of a person who moved through terrain where objects accumulated damage, whether they were used or not. The spine had cracked at some point and been reinforced with a strip of medical tape that she'd replaced twice. The first Gideon Farst had ever handed her had looked like this one by the end of its first year, and she'd asked him once if he ever replaced them with new ones. "When they're full," he'd said. "Not before." This one wasn't full. It had room for another 6 months of mornings, maybe more. She opened it to the last entry, the line she'd written on the southern ridge face after the vehicle engagement SW 16 to 18 consistent through engagement window. Solution held. She read it once. Then she closed the notebook and did not open it again. She was in the bunk room by 22:30, sitting on the cot with her knee elevated and the cold pack refreshed. The window overlooked the motor pool, same as it had the night before, but the motor pool was still now the day's vehicles back in their positions. The ground crew finished the base in the particular quietude of a forward operating post that had run a successful operation and was processing the surplus in the form of early sleep. The ridge to the northeast was not visible from this angle. She knew it was there. There was a knock at her door at 2300. She said, "Come in." Varick opened the door. He was in base uniform, no kit, holding nothing in his hands. He stood at the threshold the same way he'd stood at the base of the slope when she'd come down, giving her the approach without making a production of it. "Browd wants you at a full team session tomorrow morning," he said. 0900, dress uniform." She looked at him. Dress uniform was a specific request on a forward operating base. "That's fast," she said. "Command pushed something through tonight, before the formal record had time to sit." He leaned against the doorframe. "Word moved faster than usual up the chain." She processed that without showing what she was processing. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "The book." He meant the notebook. He'd seen it on the table in the operations tent when he'd come back for his kit, and she'd already pocketed it, but he'd seen the impression of it. "I said before that I'd seen someone keep one like it." "You didn't explain." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "My father was a sniper, 2 tours. He kept a wind log his entire career. I grew up watching him write in it every morning before he thought anyone was awake." He paused. He said it wasn't about the wind. She looked at him. He said it was about learning to pay attention to things that don't pay attention back. Varick said it simply without performance. Said most people stopped doing that after a certain age. Said the ones who didn't were different. She held that for a moment. Let it mean what it meant without putting something smaller on top of it. He was right, she said. Varick nodded. Oh, 900, he said. Get some sleep. He left the door slightly open when he went, not all the way, just the fraction that left air moving through the room, which she recognized as a small act of someone who had noticed without being told that she'd spent the previous night in a room that held heat. She lay back on the cot. The knee pulsed in its steady way. She put her hand on the notebook where it sat on the cot beside her, the same habit she had of registering it in the dark without opening it. The wind against the window was coming from the southwest. 16 knots. She knew without checking because she'd been reading it all day, and the desert didn't change its character quickly once it had settled into an afternoon pattern. It would hold this through the night and shift slightly by morning, turning a few degrees west with the cooling, and she would note that in the morning entry before anyone else was awake. She closed her eyes. Gideon Farst had been the kind of teacher who gave you things before you knew you needed them. The notebook was the obvious one. The other things were harder to name, the particular patience he'd had for the moment before a shot, the way he never said calm down because he understood that calm wasn't the goal, attention was. You could be nervous and attentive. You could be afraid and attentive. What you couldn't be was distracted and accurate. She had been attentive for 6 years, on range and off range. In briefing rooms where she wasn't being listened to, and on ridge lines where she was the only one present to listen to anything. The attention hadn't been for this specific day, it had been for every day, which meant when this specific day arrived, the attention was already there. She had not known climbing Ridge 7 with a rifle she hadn't been authorized to carry to a position no one had authorized her to occupy, whether any of it would work. She had known the math. The math was not a guarantee. The math was what you brought to a problem that was going to have variables you couldn't control, because the variables you couldn't control could only be managed by the quality of what you controlled completely. Preparation was not certainty. It was the only honest response to uncertainty. She fell asleep sometime before midnight. She slept without dreaming about Kandahar, which was not unusual. She slept without dreaming at all, which was. The morning came the way desert mornings came, not gradually but decisively, the light going from nothing to present without much negotiation. She was up before it completed itself. She dressed. She picked up the notebook. She went outside to the eastern edge of the motor pool, where the concrete barrier gave her a clear angle on the northeastern terrain, and she sat down with her back against it and waited for enough light to read the wind. Ridge 7 was visible from here. She could see the summit pale rock in the early color, the upper face catching the first light, the same way it had caught the last light yesterday in flat plains that gave the elevation away without drama. The wind came from the west this morning, lighter than yesterday, 12 knots, maybe less, cooler than it would get. The desert before the sun made its full commitment had a quality she'd noticed on every deployment and never quite gotten used to, the specific silence of a place that was gathering itself. Not peaceful exactly, just pre-everything. She opened the notebook, wrote the date and time, the temperature, west-northwest 11 knots, slight humidity. She wrote the elevation differential to Ridge 7's summit and the expected thermal pattern once the surface heating began. She wrote a second line beneath it, not numbers. She didn't often do this. Farst's notebook had always been numbers almost entirely, with the occasional word. But she wrote solution held, not as a boast, not as a record of achievement, as the specific notation of a hypothesis that had been tested against actual conditions and had not failed. That was all it was. That was enough. She heard footsteps at the corner of the motor pool. She didn't turn. She'd cataloged the pattern yesterday morning in approximately the same light. Varick came around the corner with a metal cup and stood there for a moment, reading the situation the way he'd read it yesterday, that she was doing something that had a purpose he could observe without needing explained, and that sitting down adjacent was an option that existed for him if he wanted it. He sat down on the barrier. The sky over Ridge 7 was doing something she didn't have words for, and wouldn't try to find the specific combination of desert air and elevation and the particular angle of early light that turned the rock from gray to something between amber and rose, And then as the sun cleared, the eastern terrain resolved into the plain, pale brown of exposed Sonoran granite. It happened in about 4 minutes, and then it was over, and the day was just the day. She wrote the wind reading for 0600, set the pencil against the page. Varric drank from his cup. Neither of them said anything for a long time. It was the quality of silence between people who have been through something together and don't need the something narrated back to them. She'd had this kind of silence before on other teams in other deserts, and she'd learned that it was one of the things the work occasionally gave you, that nothing else did, the specific ease of shared context that didn't require language. She had not expected to have it here at FOB Ironside with a team that had decided what she was before she opened her mouth. She had not expected anything here except the opportunity to do the job and then be evaluated on the job, which was the only thing she'd ever actually asked for from any room she'd walked into. The job had spoken. The morning was here. Varric set his cup down on the barrier between them. He looked toward the ridge, not at it specifically, just in that general direction, the way you looked at a place that had become associated with something. "My father's notebook," he said. "I have it. He kept it until the last deployment. Filled the last page the week before he came home." He paused. "I've never kept one myself." She looked at the notebook in her hands, the cracked spine, the worn corners, the accumulated mornings. She held it out to him. He looked at it, looked at her. "That's not," he started. "It's not mine to keep permanently," she said. "Farce gave it to me the same way, when his was full." She paused. "This one's not full." He took it, held it the way you held something that had weight you weren't sure how to distribute. He looked at the cover for a moment, then opened to the first blank page after her last entry. Looked at the column she'd kept, the numbers, the 2 words at the bottom, solution held. He closed it. She pulled a pencil from her chest pocket and held that out too. He took it. "Start with this morning," she said. "Winds west-northwest about 11 knots. Write what you feel against your face before you write what the instrument says. The instrument confirms. The skin knows first." He looked at the open desert, turned his face into the wind. His eyes moved the way she recognized the specific receptive quality of someone actually trying to feel something rather than observe it. He wrote. She watched him write without watching him. Looked at Ridge 7 in the morning light in the plain, honest color it wore when the theatrical moments were done, and it was just geology doing what geology did. Gideon Farst had handed her a blank notebook and told her to start now. He hadn't told her what it was for. He hadn't needed to. You paid attention to the wind because the wind was always happening and most people were always looking at something else, and the gap between those two things was where shots landed wrong and decisions came apart. And the preparation you thought you'd done turned out to be preparation for a different problem than the one in front of you. She had started. She had kept starting every morning for 6 years, which was the only way starting became something other than a beginning. She didn't need the notebook back. What she'd put into it was already in her hands. Varric finished writing. He looked at what he'd written. He had Farst's numbers. She could see the column orientation from the angle, the instinctive structure of someone who had watched this done since childhood. He'd written more than the wind, too. She didn't try to read it. "Oh, 900, she said. "Yeah." Neither of them moved immediately. The sun was fully up now, the Sonoran temperature already beginning its daily project of making everything else feel provisional. The wind was picking up slightly west-northwest 12 knots, now climbing toward the afternoon pattern that would establish itself by 10. She would not write that reading down. She let the wind know it without recording it, which was a different kind of knowing. Not documentation, but presence, the simple animal fact of a body in a place, registering what the place was doing, not because it needed to be captured, but because the registering was itself the point. The wind didn't owe her anything. She didn't owe it anything either. What they had, she and the wind and the years of morning numbers, and the notebook currently in the hands of a 26-year-old who had his father's instincts and had just started writing in them, what they had was the uncomplicated transaction of attention given and information received, which was not a guarantee of anything and had never pretended to be. It was enough to have prepared. It was enough to have been here. Ridge 7 stood in the morning light, unremarkable and exact, the same prominence in the same landscape it had been before yesterday, and would be after. The desert didn't annotate itself. It just continued vast and procedural the way large things continued when they were not concerned with being witnessed. She had been witnessed in the end. Not by the desert, by the people who had needed the ridge to be occupied and hadn't known they needed it until it was. That was the shape of most necessary things invisible until the moment they became essential, and then so clear that it was hard to understand how they'd ever been missed. She stood, adjusted her weight off the knee which accepted the morning with the specific patience of healing things. She looked at Varric, who was looking at the notebook with the expression of someone who had just made a commitment and was sitting in the first morning of it. "Don't stop when you go back home," she said. He looked up. "People think the log is about the field. It's not about the field." She looked at the sky above the ridge. "It's about paying attention on the days when nothing is happening. Those are the days that build the ones that matter." He looked back at the notebook, nodded slowly with the weight of someone receiving something they were going to have to grow into. She left him there with the pencil and the wind and the first page. She walked back through the motor pool toward the operations building, her bootsteps even, and her hands at her sides in the same unhurried way she had walked into FOB Ironside 36 hours ago when no one had known her name, and the desert had been equally indifferent to her arrival. The base was waking up around her, voices from the common building, a vehicle starting somewhere in the south lot. The smell of coffee, real coffee, not the burned remnant of yesterday's pot. The light on the eastern perimeter fence was the clear, flat light of a morning that had finished its opening and committed to the day. She had a dress uniform to put on and a room full of people to stand in front of and whatever came after that to receive, with the same steadiness she brought to everything, because that was the only way she knew how to carry weight, not by making it lighter, but by not putting anything unnecessary on top of it. But that was at 9 o'clock. It was 6:15 now, and the wind was doing what the wind did, and somewhere on the far side of the motor pool a young man was writing down what his face was telling him before the instrument could confirm it. The day was beginning, the way good days began quietly before anyone declared it significant, in the ordinary minutes, when the important things were still just things moving through the world without announcement, exactly as they had always been and would continue to be long after any of them stopped watching. She walked toward the light. "If you've been with this story from the beginning, thank you." Wren didn't need anyone's permission to climb that ridge. But she needed years of mornings no one saw to be ready when she did. Is there something in your own life that you've been building quietly in the mornings before anyone else is awake? Drop it in the comments. We read every one.